A spring, a simple patch of stone and water left to me by my uncle. But what started as a peaceful inheritance turned into an all-out war when a ruthless HOA president poured concrete into my well, thinking she could erase history and silence me for good. What she didn't know, I was already 10 steps ahead. And the more she tried to destroy me, the more truth she unearthed, truth that could ruin her life and take down everything her family built on lies. This isn't just a story about water rights. It's about legacy, deception, and a reckoning that's been decades in the making. You won't believe where this goes. So stick with me, drop a comment below, and tell me where you're watching from. I promise you're not going to want to miss what's coming next. I never planned on moving back to the mountains. Honestly, I figured I'd spend my retirement somewhere flat, warm, and close to a decent VA hospital. But when Uncle Ray passed and left me his cabin in Ridgewood Hollow, something told me I needed to go. Maybe it was the way he always spoke about that place, like it wasn't just a home, but a piece of living history. Or maybe it was that old spring on the property he used to brag about, the one he said had kept our family going through blizzards, droughts, and even the Depression. Either way, I packed up my life, left Arizona behind, and drove up into the Colorado Rockies, not realizing I was walking straight into a war I never asked for. The first time I saw the cabin again after all those years, I almost cried. It was smaller than I remembered, weather-worn and tucked beneath tall pines, with a chimney that leaned just slightly to the left, like it had a secret to tell. The spring was still there, nestled behind a stone wall Uncle Ray had built with his own 2 hands back in the 60s. Water flowed steadily, clear as glass. It hadn't changed a bit. The property came with 5 acres, thick with trees, wildflowers, and silence. No city hum, no traffic. Just wind, birds, and that ever-present trickle of spring water. I stood by that spring, bent down, scooped some water in my hand, and took a sip, cold, pure. Just like I remembered, from when I was a boy visiting during summers. For a moment, I felt like Uncle Ray was standing behind me, arms crossed, giving one of those rare, tight-lipped smiles. But my peace didn't last long. 2 days after I moved in, while I was hauling firewood from the shed, a shiny black SUV pulled up to the edge of the gravel drive. Out stepped a woman dressed like she was headed to a country club luncheon, blonde bob, pearl earrings, pastel windbreaker. She smiled wide, too wide, and started walking straight toward me like she already owned the place. "You must be Walter Bennett," she said, offering a hand that didn't look like it had ever held anything heavier than a salad fork. Patricia Caldwell. But everyone calls me Trish. I'm the president of the Ridgewood Hollow Homeowners Association. I wiped my hand on my jeans before shaking hers, already feeling a chill despite the sunshine. "Nice to meet you, Trish. This property's been in my family for 3 generations. "Yes, well," she said, glancing around with a slight wrinkle in her nose. "I was hoping to discuss a few things with you. That spring out back, for example. It's charming in a rustic way, but it's not exactly in line with Ridgewood's landscaping standards." I stared at her for a beat. "You mean the spring that predates the HOA by, 80 years? She blinked. "The HOA has community-wide rules that apply to all properties, regardless of when they were built." I shook my head. "Not this one. Uncle Ray had it exempted when the HOA was formed. I've got the original documents filed with the county. This place isn't subject to HOA rules. Not landscaping, not fencing, not paint color. Nothing." For a split second, her smile cracked. But then it returned, tighter this time. "Well, we'll need to verify that. In the meantime, I'll be documenting some concerns. There are also issues with your fencing height, the shed's roof line, and of course the water feature. We wouldn't want someone to fall in and hurt themselves." Before I could respond, she pulled out her phone, snapped a picture of my front yard, and walked briskly back to her SUV. That night, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my door. 3 counts: unauthorized water structure, unapproved outbuilding, and non-compliant natural landscaping. Each came with a $100 per day fine. I laughed, then didn't, because I knew these types of people. Trish wasn't here to enforce community standards. She was here to assert control. I called the number listed on the notice and reached someone named Becky, the HOA secretary. She sounded young, a little nervous, and said Trish had probably jumped the gun a little, but the fines were active unless I could provide proof of exemption at the next board meeting. So that night I stayed up late digging through Uncle Ray's old files. There they were, yellowed, brittle documents with a county seal and signatures from when Ridgewood Hollow was incorporated. Uncle Ray had negotiated a full exemption for the cabin property. It was all there in black and white. I made copies, digital backups, printed extras. Then I made a folder labeled Trish Insurance and locked it in my fireproof safe. 2 days later, while planting tomatoes beside the cabin, I saw a couple walking past. They waved, so I stood and greeted them. Turned out they were Don and Mabel Hatcher, retired school teachers who had lived in the Hollow since the 90s. We chatted for a while, and they were quick to mention, in hushed voices, that I wasn't the first to butt heads with Trish. She had our bird bath removed 2 years ago, Mabel said, her voice tight with frustration. Said it attracted unsanitary wildlife. It was a gift from our son. She's been president of the HOA for 10 years, Don added. And she's got a knack for making problems where there weren't any. I invited them in for coffee. Over our cups, they told me about the Rodriguez family who had to paint over their colorful mural, and Mr. Lasky, whose vintage trailer got towed from his own driveway. Trish, they said, ran the HOA like a dictatorship with a smile. That night, I installed trail cameras around the property, visible ones and hidden ones. I didn't know what Trish was planning, but I wasn't going to wait to find out the hard way. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. Same violations. Fines started ticking. That's when I called Elaine Patterson, an attorney I'd met years back during a water conservation hearing. I told her what was going on, emailed her scans of the documents. Sounds like she's bluffing, Elaine said. But people like that rarely stop until they're forced to. Keep everything documented. Everything. And Walt, don't underestimate her. That afternoon, I sat by the spring with Max, my old golden retriever, watching the sun drip behind the pines. The water trickled softly through the moss-covered stones, just like it had for a century. It had survived storms, wildfires, and neglect. But something told me this next battle wouldn't be fought with weather or time. It would be fought with lies, paperwork, and concrete. It didn't take long for Trish to start showing up uninvited. I was out back clearing some fallen branches near the spring, trying to enjoy the warm morning breeze, when I heard the crunch of gravel. I looked up and there she was again. Same polished windbreaker, oversized sunglasses this time, and holding what looked like a clipboard. She stood at the edge of my property like she was evaluating livestock, or planning a takeover. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she said, as if we were old friends, just conducting a routine walkthrough of the neighborhood. HOA responsibilities, you understand. "Morning," I replied, wiping sweat from my brow. Didn't realize a routine walkthrough included trespassing. That made her pause. She glanced down at her sneakers, then back up at me with that same tight-lipped smile. "I'm not on your property. I'm within the easement boundaries." I walked a few steps closer. "You're 3 feet past the old survey marker. I had the boundary rechecked last week." She didn't argue, but I could see her jaw tighten. "Well, it's always good to double-check. You wouldn't believe how often these mountain properties have encroachments." Then she pulled out her clipboard and started flipping pages. "There are several concerns still unresolved. The roof on your shed is sagging, which may constitute a safety hazard. Your front porch lacks the approved railing design. And the spring, well, that remains a pressing issue." I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. "I already sent the HOA the exemption paperwork. This land isn't subject to Ridgewood Hollow's covenants. It's on record at the county." Yes, she waved a hand like brushing away a gnat. "I've seen your documents. But let me be frank, Mr. Bennett, this spring is a liability. Children could fall in. Mosquitoes breed in stagnant water. It doesn't reflect the aesthetic harmony our community values. I was about to respond when she reached into her bag and handed me a printed flyer. HOA safety reminder. It read in bold red letters. Unapproved water features may result in fines or corrective action. I stared at it. You're threatening to fill it in, aren't you? Her voice dropped to a tone that sounded almost maternal, but with an edge. We'd hate for something unfortunate to happen. Imagine a neighborhood child getting hurt because of an outdated structure. That would be tragic. Best to be proactive. There it was, the real threat behind the smile. I folded the flyer and tucked it into my back pocket. I'll take that under advisement. She gave one last smile, colder than a January breeze, and walked back to her SUV. Later that day, Don and Mabel stopped by again. Don was carrying a small bag of homemade oatmeal cookies, and Mabel had that look like she needed to get something off her chest. She came by our house too, Mabel said, pulling her sweater tighter. Told us we might be out of compliance because of our mailbox paint color. She even took a photo of our birdhouse, Don muttered. Said it might attract raccoons. I invited them in, and we had coffee in the kitchen. The conversation quickly turned to Trish and how many neighbors she'd already cornered with citations, warnings, and veiled threats. It felt like we were living in some twisted version of Pleasantville, where one woman held the deed to everyone's dignity. She's targeting you, Mabel said, her voice hushed. You embarrassed her at that first meeting. That spring is just the excuse. That night, I sat down at the old desk in Uncle Ray's study and started a logbook. Date, time, incident, names. I printed out screenshots of my trail cam footage. I photographed the property from every angle: shed roof, fencing, the spring. I was building a record, because people like Trish don't fight fair. 3 days later, I got another letter in the mail, certified, signed by the HOA board, though one signature looked suspiciously like it had been added after the others. Same violations, same daily fines, but this time they included a warning about potential emergency action if hazards were not addressed. Emergency action. I called Elaine, my attorney, and read the letter out loud. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then, that phrase worries me. If she's threatening emergency authority, she might be planning to take action while you're away. I have a veterans reunion in Denver next weekend, I told her. Don't leave the property unattended unless it's monitored. Install more cameras, and make sure the well is documented and flagged as a water source. The next morning, I called a security company and had them install motion-activated cameras, some obvious, some discreet. I also ordered weatherproof signs marking the spring as a primary water source, and posted a laminated copy of my exemption document right next to it, sealed in plastic. The only other time I saw Trish that week was through my kitchen window. She stood across the street talking to two younger women pointing toward my cabin. They laughed. She didn't. Then came a knock at the door. This time it was someone I hadn't met, a man in his 60s, tall, wearing an old Broncos hat. Name's Leo Garcia, he said, offering a hand. Used to serve on the state's historical preservation board. Don and Mabel said you might need help. I brought him out to the spring. He studied the stonework, took notes, and nodded approvingly. This might qualify, he said. Hand-built pre-WWI. Original infrastructure, still functioning. That's a rare combo. If you file the paperwork, I can help get it expedited. He handed me a packet and a list of things to prepare. That night, I sat on the back porch, Max snoring at my feet, watching the moonlight reflect off the water. Trish wanted to destroy this place, not just because of some spring, but because it was a reminder that some things, some people don't bend to her rules. She saw my independence as a threat. I wasn't planning on being a threat, but if that's what it took to protect my uncle's legacy, then so be it. It's a strange thing, feeling like a prisoner in a place you love. Ridgewood Hollow was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a legacy passed down from my uncle, nestled in the mountains. where I could live out my years in peace. But after everything Trish Caldwell had pulled in just 2 weeks, it felt like I was defending a castle under siege. That night after Leo Garcia visited, I stayed up late, going through everything again, old deeds, Uncle Ray's correspondence, even a few faded newspaper clippings he'd tucked away in a folder labeled Covenants. One article from the early 80s talked about the formation of Ridgewood Hollows HOA and how certain legacy properties were given special exemption due to their age, infrastructure, and original water rights. My parcel was named directly. I made 3 physical copies of that article. I scanned it and emailed it to Elaine, my lawyer, just in case something happened. I didn't want to get blindsided. I wasn't just protecting my home anymore. I was preparing for battle. The next morning, I took a ride down to the county clerk's office and filed a formal request to certify the spring as a historic site. Leo had told me exactly what documents I needed. The clerk, a young woman named Jamie, looked surprised when I handed her the packet. "You're the 3rd person this week to come in asking about Ridgewood Hollow," she said, flipping through the papers. "Is something going on up there?" I just smiled and said, "Let's call it a local disagreement." As soon as I got back home, I walked the perimeter of my property, checking all the cameras. Everything looked undisturbed. The spring was still flowing. Max was dozing on the porch, completely oblivious to the war I was bracing for. Then came the HOA meeting. I almost didn't go. I knew how it would go down. Trish had been president for years. She knew the board, and I was just the newcomer stirring the pot. But Elaine convinced me it was important to show up, present the documents, and get everything on record. The meeting was held in the community center, at the base of the hill. I wore my cleanest flannel shirt, brought my file folder, and walked in 10 minutes early. You'd have thought I was crashing a wedding. People stopped talking the second I walked through the door. Trish was at the front of the room, seated like a queen behind a long folding table with 4 other board members beside her. She smiled like nothing had ever happened. "Mr. Bennett?" she said with sugary sweetness. "Glad you could make it." I nodded and took a seat near the back. The first half of the meeting was dull, someone complaining about garbage bins not being put away fast enough, another person asking about fire mitigation funding, and then Trish cleared her throat and said, "Next item on the agenda, property violations at 132 Deer Ridge Lane." That was me. She began rattling off her list again: unsafe water structure, unauthorized shed repairs, non-conforming landscaping. Despite repeated notices, she said the resident has refused to comply or work with the board to bring the property up to code. I stood up. My voice was calm, but loud enough for the room. "That's because the property isn't under your jurisdiction. I have the original development agreement, signed and recorded. The property was exempted before this HOA ever existed." I walked forward and handed the documents to the board secretary, Becky, who looked more nervous than usual. I also handed her a copy of the historical article and the application receipt for state landmark status. Trish didn't even glance at the papers. "These documents," she said crisply, "will be reviewed by the HOA's legal counsel. Until then, our fines and violation process stands. If hazards persist, we reserve the right to enact emergency measures to protect the neighborhood." I turned to face the rest of the room. I'm not trying to stir trouble. But this isn't about some cracked stone wall or overgrown lavender. This is about one person trying to steamroll over history, over law, and over common decency. There was a beat of silence. Then a couple of claps from the back. I looked over and saw Don and Mabel nodding. I also noticed one of the board members, an older guy, with silver hair, looking down at the papers I gave him with furrowed brows. After the meeting, Trish cornered me by the coffee urn. "You're wasting your time," she said under her breath. "People around here don't like confrontation. They want peace. You're upsetting the balance." I leaned in. "I'm not upsetting anything, you are. I'm just not rolling over like everyone else." She gave a tight-lipped smile. "Be careful, Mr. Bennett. You might find the board acting sooner than you expect." It was a clear warning. That night, I doubled down. I reviewed camera feeds, checked every document, made new digital backups, and even bought a second external hard drive just to be safe. The next day, Mabel came over holding a pie and something else in an envelope. "This came to us by mistake," she said, handing it over. "Post office probably messed up again." Inside was a typed letter addressed to all Ridgewood board members. It had been written by Trish. I recognized her phrasing right away. She was proposing an emergency vote to begin corrective action on my spring under Section 8.3 of the HOA bylaws, claiming it posed an imminent hazard to community safety. She attached a photo, clearly taken from behind my fence, of the spring at dusk, edited to make the water look murky and dark. She called it a potential drowning risk. I felt my chest tighten. She wasn't waiting for legal review. She was moving ahead with her plan. That evening, I stood in front of the spring and stared at it for a long time. The water still flowed gently over the rocks, clear and undisturbed. A breeze rustled through the pines. It looked as peaceful as always, but now I saw it as something else. A target. I knelt down and ran my hand over the stones Uncle Ray had laid, one by one. He built this not just as a water source, but as a legacy. A reminder that some things are worth preserving, worth protecting. If Trish thought she could bury it in concrete and no one would fight back, she hadn't met me yet. When I left for Denver, I thought I had done everything right. Cameras installed, documents secured, neighbors informed. I even asked Don and Mabel to check in every couple of days, just to be sure. The veterans event was something I'd been planning to attend for months. It was our old platoon's 50-year reunion, guys I hadn't seen in decades. There was no way I was going to miss it. Still, as I pulled away from my cabin that morning, I had a strange weight in my gut. The sky was overcast, and the wind had that sharp, unpredictable edge mountain air sometimes gets before a storm. Max watched from the porch with his tail low, like he didn't want me to go either. I was only gone for 5 days, but 5 days was all Trish needed. It was late when I got back around 10 p.m., rain just starting to fall. The tires of my truck crunched up the gravel drive, and my headlights swept across the front yard. Then I saw it. Something didn't look right. The spring, my uncle's spring, wasn't there. Where the curved stone wall had been was now a lumpy gray mound. It looked like a cement blister rising from the earth. The wooden lattice roof that had shaded the spring for decades lay splintered in the mud like someone had smashed it with a hammer. I slammed the truck into park and ran through the rain, slipping in the wet grass. My boots hit the edge of the concrete, and I dropped to my knees, hands scrambling over the rough, cold surface. It was fully hardened, solid. Someone had filled the entire spring with concrete. I couldn't even breathe. The spring that had served my family for generations, the one I drank from as a boy, that Uncle Ray had maintained like a shrine, was gone, buried. "No," I growled out loud, pounding my fist against the mound. "No, no, no, no." A motion light clicked on next door, and through the sheets of rain I saw her, Trish, standing on her porch, bathrobe neatly tied, cup of tea in one hand like she'd just stepped out of a spa commercial. And even from that distance, I could see it. She was smiling. Rage like I hadn't felt in years rose up in me. Not since the war had I felt that burning heat crawl up the back of my neck, that pulse in my ears. I stormed across the yard, through the rain, straight up to her porch. She didn't even flinch. "What did you do to my spring?" I shouted, the words sharp, desperate. She took a sip of her tea. The board voted. Section 8.3 Emergency Hazard Mitigation. That open pit was a danger to the community. You filled it with concrete. That was my water source. She disappeared into the house and returned with a plastic folder, dry and crisp. "You were sent multiple notices," she said, flipping to a page with printed photos. "You failed to act." The board was forced to intervene. She handed me a paper with signatures. I recognized a couple of them from the meeting, but the fine print said temporary safety cover, not destruction. I was gone for a few days, I said, my voice trembling. You knew that. You waited until I left. She shrugged. Your absence demonstrated an inability to maintain a hazardous structure. We took corrective measures. Any further concerns can be addressed at the next board meeting. Then she closed the door. I stood there, drenched, the paper soaking through in my hand. And then I did the only thing I could think of. I called the sheriff's office. The deputy who showed up was young, probably mid-20s, polite but clearly unsure what to do. He took one look at the concrete and whistled. Yikes! That's permanent. She did this while I was away. I've got cameras, footage, documents. This spring's registered for historical consideration. He nodded slowly, then said what I'd already feared. This might be a civil issue, sir. Between you and your HOA. I can file a report, but it'll probably need to go to court. After he left, I went inside, stripped off my soaked clothes, and booted up my computer. I went straight to the security footage. Sure enough, there it was time-stamped and clear as day. Trish, standing in my yard 2 mornings after I left, directing a concrete truck like a foreman. The driver looked confused, but she held up papers and pointed toward the spring. 2 workers, in bright vests and hard hats, began unloading the cement into the water source, covering it completely. Trish supervised the entire process, clipboard in hand. She didn't just take action. She orchestrated the demolition of a historical water structure on private, exempted property. The next morning, I called Elaine. She watched the video in silence, then slowly exhaled. This is going to make her regret everything. We're suing, I said flatly. Oh, absolutely. But not just for damages. What she did might qualify as criminal vandalism. And if that well was even temporarily approved as a historical site, she's in serious trouble. She filled it in before I even got the confirmation. Elaine paused, then asked, Did you check your mail? I dug through the pile on my counter. Sure enough, there it was, an envelope from the State Office of Historical Preservation. I tore it open with trembling fingers. Congratulations. Your application to register the Bennett Spring as a protected historical landmark has been approved. Dated 3 days before the cement truck showed up. I stared at that piece of paper like it was a golden ticket. My frustration turned to focus. She'd picked the worst possible moment to pull her little stunt. I had the video. I had the documents. I had the official registration. And now I had a plan. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mound of concrete, that smug grin on Trish's face, and the way she said corrective measures like it was a mercy. I kept replaying the footage, frame by frame, watching her supervise the destruction like she was doing a public service. By morning, my rage had cooled into something sharper clarity. Elaine was already drafting the lawsuit when I called her. She said she'd include not just Trish, but the entire HOA board. They're liable, she told me. Even if some of them didn't authorize the action, they're part of the entity that carried it out. And with that footage, we have them dead to rights. She also contacted a preservation expert who could evaluate the damage for the court. Meanwhile, I got to work organizing every shred of evidence I had. I printed out timestamps, security footage stills, HOA notices, emails, even the weather report from the day they poured the concrete. I made 2 binders, one for the lawyer, one for court. I wasn't just fighting back. I was going to bury her in paper the same way she'd buried my spring in cement. Then came the surprise. That afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, 4 people were standing on my porch. Don and Mabel, of course, but also Julia Marks, a retired nurse from down the street, and Mr. Rodriguez, who I'd only seen in passing before. We heard what happened, Julia said, and we're not staying quiet anymore. They came inside, dripping with stories I hadn't heard. Julia's koi pond? Trish had it filled in while she was away visiting her granddaughter. Claimed it was a mosquito hazard. No warning. Just gone. Mr. Rodriguez had pictures on his phone photos of Trish measuring my spring with a tape measure 2 days before the pour. He'd seen her taking notes. I didn't know what she was up to, he admitted, but now it all makes sense. Mabel said she'd seen the concrete truck, but assumed it was for someone doing driveway work. When I asked one of the workers what they were doing, she said, they told me it was an HOA emergency repair. All of it more fuel for the fire. And then, as if the universe decided I needed just one more reason to push forward, a brick came flying through my living room window around 9:30 that night. It shattered the glass and knocked over a lamp. Max barked like a maniac. I ducked down instinctively, heart pounding. When I got to the window, I saw the brick lying on the floor with a note wrapped around it in duct tape. Drop the lawsuit, or worse will happen. The handwriting was blocky, angry, and unmistakably written by someone who thought they were scarier than they were. Still, my hands were shaking as I dialed the sheriff's department. This time, they sent Deputy Monroe. Older, wiser, different energy altogether. She took the threat seriously, bagged the note for evidence, took photos. Asked me to send her the security footage I had of the front yard. Threats like this cross a line, she said. This isn't just a civil matter anymore, I nodded. Good, because I'm done playing nice. Word traveled fast. By the next morning, a news van was parked outside my driveway. I'd barely finished my coffee when a young reporter stepped out, microphone in hand, said they got an anonymous tip about HOA abuse in Ridgewood Hollow. I almost slammed the door in their face until I saw the camera guy, and something in me shifted. I invited them in. They interviewed me on the porch, asking about the spring, the lawsuit, the threat. I held up the historical certification and showed them the still shot of Trish pointing at the well while the concrete poured in. I'm not trying to fight my neighbors, I said, looking straight at the camera. But this is bigger than landscaping rules. This is about power, control, and people thinking they're above the law. The story ran that night on the local 10 o'clock news. By morning, I had over 20 emails and a dozen voicemails, people from other neighborhoods, even other states, sharing their own horror stories about tyrannical HOAs. Some offered legal advice. Others just wanted to say, thank you for standing up. But not everyone was supportive. That afternoon, I walked outside to find a sign planted in my front yard. Wells kill property values. Another one next to it, comply or leave. Across the street, a group of neighbors stood watching. A few I recognized, a few I didn't. No one waved. I took photos of the signs and removed them calmly. I wasn't going to give them the drama they were clearly hoping for. Elaine called later, said she'd seen the news clip. You did good, she told me. But be careful. That kind of exposure puts you on people's radar. I told her about the signs, the threat, the stares. She sighed. We're filing the lawsuit tomorrow. Once that happens, things might escalate. Keep documenting. And stay alert. As the sun set, I sat on the porch with Max curled up by my feet. For the first time since returning from Denver, I felt like I could breathe again, even if just for a moment. The spring was gone, but the fight had finally turned. And somehow, I knew Trish wasn't going to take that lying down. I thought things couldn't get more tense in Ridgewood Hollow, but I was wrong. After the news story aired, it felt like the entire neighborhood picked sides. Every trip to the mailbox became a gamble. Some folks waved and nodded like I was some kind of local hero. Others wouldn't even make eye contact. One lady, Becky, from the HOA board actually turned her back and pulled her dog across the street when she saw me coming. Max just wagged his tail like nothing was wrong. But things were wrong. I started getting anonymous texts, most of them veiled threats. People here don't like troublemakers. Not everything can be fixed with lawyers. One simply read, "You should have just filled it in yourself." Elaine told me not to respond to any of them. Save them, screenshot everything. We'll add them to the file. And the file was growing fast. Then, one morning, I stepped out to get the paper and found a fresh set of signs on my lawn. This time, they were staked deeper into the ground, like whoever planted them wanted them to stay. History WONT, Pay the HOA dues. The well is dead. Move on. Our neighborhood. Our rules. I took more photos. Removed the signs. Again. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Around noon that day, I was retrieving a delivery from the porch when Trish walked up the sidewalk, flanked by two men I'd never seen before. Big guys. Built like they used to bounce at nightclubs or prisons. One wore mirrored sunglasses, the other had a tattoo on his neck that looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Trish was dressed in an all-white suit, like some villain from a soap opera. She smiled wide. "Walter," she said sweetly, "may we have a moment of your time?" I didn't answer, just looked at the two men. "Who are they?" "Licensed safety inspectors," she said. "The HOA has hired them to conduct daily inspections of any properties involved in litigation. To ensure compliance and, of course, to protect community standards." One of the men took a step forward. "We'll need access to the interior of the home." I crossed my arms. "You'll need a court order for that." Trish tilted her head. "Walter, this kind of resistance doesn't reflect well on you. If you're so sure you're in the right, why not let us do our job? Because your job apparently includes throwing bricks and pouring cement," I said. That wiped the smile off her face for a moment, but then it returned just thinner, colder. "Fine," she said. "But don't be surprised if code enforcement gets involved next. This home is, after all, well past its prime." They turned and walked off. But as they did, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The guy with the tattoo? His ink matched the blocky handwriting on the brick thrower's note. I called Elaine. "This is going too far," I told her. "Now she's sending guys to intimidate me." "Document it," she said. "And you're not staying there tonight. I'm filing for an emergency hearing first thing tomorrow. Go stay with someone." I packed a bag and went to Don and Mabel's place for the night. They insisted. Mabel even made her famous cinnamon tea, and Don gave me the spare bedroom like I was family. That evening, just as we were sitting down to play cards, there was a soft knock at their back door. We all froze. Don went to check, and when he opened it, I nearly dropped the deck in my hand. It was Mrs. Jenkins. Now, if you don't know her, she's 78 years old, lives 2 doors down from me, and doesn't say much beyond good morning. But tonight, her hands were trembling. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, stepping inside. "But you need to know what Margaret is planning." That's right, she didn't call her Trish. She called her by her real name, Margaret. She had a meeting, Mrs. Jenkins said. Just a few of her closest supporters. I overheard part of it through the hedge. "She's trying to find a way to have your historical status revoked." Said she has a contact at the state who can or assesses the paperwork. Elaine had warned me something like this could happen. But then Mrs. Jenkins said something that made my jaw clench. "She's also telling people you threatened her, that you came to her door and shouted violent things, that you scared her so badly she's considering a restraining order." "That's a lie," I said. I know, dear," Mrs. Jenkins cut me off. "That's why I came. She's done this before. Tried to get my rose garden torn out last year. Claimed it was non-compliant vegetation. My husband planted those roses 40 years ago. After she left, I sat alone for a while on Don and Mabel's porch. The night air was cool, the stars were out, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. I held Max close, ran my fingers through his fur, trying to think clearly. Then I realized something was wrong. His collar was damp. His paws had mud on them. I bolted up and checked the gate. Still latched. He hadn't gone out. Someone had brought him in. We searched for hours. Nothing made sense. He'd been in the fenced backyard, and suddenly, he wasn't. There were no signs of digging, no broken latches. Around midnight, I got a text from an unknown number. "Check Trish's shed." We saw her dragging something earlier. I didn't hesitate. I called Deputy Monroe. She met me at Trish's house within 20 minutes. I explained what was going on, about Max, the text, everything. Trish opened the door in her silk robe, feigning confusion. "You again? What now?" Deputy Monroe was firm. "We have reason to believe a missing pet may be on your property." Trish scoffed. That's absurd. But when she opened the shed, Max ran out, dehydrated, shaking. But okay, she stammered some excuse about keeping him safe after finding him digging. But the security footage from the Johnsons' house told the real story. They caught her luring Max with treats, then carrying him, wrapped in a towel, into her shed. Elaine called the next morning and said, "That just crossed into criminal territory." I nodded. "She's not going to stop, is she?" "No," Elaine replied, "but now we don't have to either." The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived like a storm cloud that had been gathering all month. Word had spread fast between the concrete, the news segment, the lawsuit, the missing dog, and now the criminal report. I wasn't just the guy with the spring anymore. I was the center of a neighborhood civil war. The community center parking lot was packed. More cars than I'd ever seen there. People who normally kept to themselves were suddenly chatting in tense little groups outside the building. Some smiled at me, some didn't. I walked in with Elaine by my side, a thick binder of evidence under her arm. She'd flown in the night before and stayed at a local inn, just in case Trish had friends in high places who might try something. Trish was already inside, standing by the front of the room in a tailored navy suit like she was running for office. And from the way she smiled and shook hands with the crowd, you'd think she believed. She still had full control of the board, but things were shifting. The moment she took the microphone, I saw the change in the room. Some eyes were on her, but more were watching me, waiting. "Good evening, neighbors," she said, flashing her signature tight-lipped smile. "We're here tonight to address an unfortunate situation that has created division in our community. As you know, one of our residents has filed a lawsuit against the HOA and myself personally, based on actions taken to protect our neighborhood." She gestured to a giant foam core poster on an easel, an enlarged, heavily edited photo of the spring. The angle made the well look deep and dark, the stones crumbling, water pooling ominously. "This unsightly and dangerous feature," she continued, "has long been a concern, and when the resident failed to comply with multiple notices, the board enacted its emergency authority. Now, however, we are being accused of misconduct, even criminal behavior, based on exaggerated claims and emotional manipulation." She glanced my way briefly before looking back at the crowd. "We must ask ourselves, if this one structure is allowed to remain, what comes next? Broken down cars? Farm animals? Junkyards disguised as heritage? We must protect our property values and the integrity of Ridgewood Hollow." There were a few scattered claps, but far fewer than I expected. I stepped up when she was done. Elaine followed, placing a laptop beside the projector and connecting it without a word. I didn't start with an attack. Instead, I took a breath and said, "I came to Ridgewood Hollow to live out the rest of my life in peace. This cabin belonged to my uncle. He built that spring cover with his bare hands. It's provided water for my family for over 70 years, and it was registered as a historical site 3 days before it was destroyed." Elaine played the first video. It showed Trish in my yard, pointing toward the spring while 2 workers pumped wet cement into the well. The date and time were clearly stamped on the footage. Then we showed the next clip, Trish dragging Max into her shed. The room was silent. But the biggest shock came when Thomas Reed, the HOA's former president, stood up from the second row and stepped forward. "I have something to add," he said, holding a file folder. "I was on the board when the vote to address Mr. Bennett's spring was supposedly taken. But what Trish showed us was a document that said temporary safety modifications. What she filed with the contractor. It said complete removal. These signatures, mine included, were reused, reprinted, and attached to a different order entirely." He handed the originals to Elaine, who laid them on the projector screen side by side. The forgery was blatant. The crowd began to murmur. Trish's jaw clenched, but she didn't say anything. Then Dawn stood. She told us we'd get fined if we didn't support the removal. Then Mabel. She threatened to have our property reassessed. Then Julia Marks, She did the same thing to my koi pond. It was like a floodgate, opened. One by one, neighbors stood up and began telling their stories: bullying, false violations, surprise visits from so-called inspectors, threats to property values if they didn't conform. The HOA board, at least what was left of it, huddled near the side of the room. Becky, the secretary, looked like she was about to cry. Elaine stepped forward, voice steady and calm. This is no longer about a spring. This is about abuse of power, property, destruction, fraud. We're filing not only a civil lawsuit for damages, but we've opened a criminal case regarding the forged documents and unlawful tampering with a registered historic landmark. That got Trish's attention. She finally spoke, loud enough for everyone to hear. You think you've won? You think you're the hero here? Your little well was a blight. It brought down property values. It was a symbol of decay, not history. She turned to the room. Everything I've done, everything, was to keep this neighborhood from falling apart. Elaine raised an eyebrow. Then maybe you shouldn't have falsified board approvals. The room practically gasped. The board called an immediate vote. Trish was removed as president unanimously. They also agreed to cooperate fully with the restoration of the well and to allocate HOA reserve funds to repair the damage caused by unauthorized actions. As I walked out of that meeting, dozens of people came up to shake my hand. Some apologized. Others just looked relieved. But as I got to my truck, I noticed Trish standing across the parking lot. She was alone now. No friends, no backup, just her and a face that no longer wore that plastic smile. She shouted across the lot, "You have no idea what you've uncovered. Your precious uncle wasn't who you thought he was. Ask about the Henderson property deal. Ask what he buried with that spring." I froze. Henderson? She got into her car and drove off before I could say anything else. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The legal battle wasn't over. The concrete was still in my spring, but the community had turned. Trish had finally been exposed. Still, I couldn't sleep, because now I had a new question keeping me awake. What exactly did Uncle Ray bury beneath that well? I didn't sleep much after the HOA meeting. Trish's final words kept bouncing around in my head like a loose marble in a tin can. Ask about the Henderson property deal. Ask what he buried with that spring. What the hell did that mean? I'd known my Uncle Ray my whole life. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he was steady, honest, quiet in that old-school way men from his generation were. He didn't talk about the past unless you asked, and even then, he'd give you just enough to satisfy your curiosity and not a word more. But what Trish said stuck with me, and now I had to know. The very next morning, I started digging figuratively first. I went through every folder in Uncle Ray's old filing cabinet, every drawer, every box. I scanned through property records, letters, even receipts for fencing supplies from 1975. That's when I found a name, Franklin Henderson. It was on a loan document from 1976. Not a bank loan, but a personal one. Uncle Ray had written a check for $8,200 to Franklin Henderson, marked emergency irrigation back parcel. There was no other context. No follow-up documents. But that one line was enough to light a fire in my gut. Elaine helped me pull up county records. The Hendersons had once owned the land just beyond mine, several acres, that had since been developed into part of Ridgewood Hollow. The records showed a sudden transfer of ownership in the late 70s. No sale price, just a trust swap. A bank was involved, one that no longer existed. It felt fishy. I reached out to the county archives and got a copy of the original land plat. That's when things got strange. One of the boundary lines on Uncle Ray's parcel was marked with a special annotation reversionary clause pending compliance. See Addendum A. Addendum A was missing. Elaine raised an eyebrow when I showed it to her. That's usually legal speak for a trigger clause. If someone violates the agreement, ownership could revert to the previous owner. Revert back to us. That's when the restoration crew showed up. A team of preservation specialists sent by the Historical Society, along with a structural engineer. Their job was to assess whether the spring could be salvaged or if it was gone for good. They brought in drilling equipment to break through the hardened concrete without damaging the original stonework underneath. It took hours. I stood by the whole time, heart pounding like I was watching surgery on a family member. Then one of the workers called out, Mr. Bennett? You're gonna want to see this." They'd broken through to the lower part of the well, and inside a side chamber, wedged into the stonework, was a waterproof steel box. It wasn't just tossed in there. It had been sealed inside, hidden deliberately. One of the workers said, "That craftsmanship is no joke. Whoever put this here knew what they were doing. We brought it into the house." My hands were shaking as I unlatched the rusted clamps and opened the lid. Inside was a bundle of papers, dry as a bone. Old land deeds, loan agreements, and a letter handwritten by my uncle. "To whoever finds this, if someone's come for the well, then they're coming for more than just water. They're coming to erase what happened here." He went on to explain everything. In 1976, there was a drought so severe it nearly ruined every family in the valley. Franklin Henderson had come to Uncle Ray, desperate. The local bank, run by Trish's father, refused to give him a loan. But Ray had savings and gave Franklin enough to install irrigation and keep his farm running. In return, Franklin signed over a future interest clause in his property stating that if the land was ever sold under fraudulent terms, or if any of the original natural features were destroyed, it would revert to Ray's family. And Trish's father? He'd foreclosed on the Hendersons anyway, used forged documents to claim the land was in default. He then gifted that land to his daughter, Patricia Caldwell, through a shell trust. Elaine looked at the documents and nodded slowly. "This changes everything." We went to the courthouse first thing the next day, filed a motion to reopen title on Trish's property. We now had enough evidence to argue that her home and part of the surrounding lots had been acquired through fraudulent means, tied to her father's banking scheme. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing. News spread faster than wildfire. That night, I sat out by the spring. The top layer of concrete had been chipped away, revealing the old stones beneath. The water hadn't fully come back yet, but I could hear the trickle, like it was waking up. Frank Henderson himself showed up at my door the next morning, older now, in his 80s, leaning on a cane. "You found the box," he said simply. I nodded. He sat at my table and told me how my uncle had saved his family, how Ray had testified in a closed-door banking commission to protect others from getting swindled, and how he'd hidden the truth for decades because he feared Trish's father would retaliate. "She's not just trying to erase history," Frank said. "She's trying to cover her family's tracks." By the time we returned to court 3 days later, we had affidavits from multiple witnesses, confirmation from the county clerk that the documents were authentic, and even a state banking investigator who reviewed the original fraud. Trish was there too, of course flanked by a new lawyer who looked like he regretted taking the case before the hearing even began. The judge listened carefully. Then she looked over the stack of documents and said, "This court recognizes the reversionary clause as valid and enforceable. Based on the clear violations committed by the defendant and her family trust, this property along with the spring shall be restored to the Bennett estate." Trish gasped. Her lawyer turned pale. The judge continued, "All related criminal charges regarding document tampering and vandalism remain under separate investigation. For the purposes of this civil matter, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff." As I walked out of that courthouse, it felt like something had finally shifted, not just in the neighborhood but in me. I'd come to Ridgewood Hollow looking for peace. I didn't expect to uncover corruption, lies, or the secret my uncle spent his life protecting. But now that the truth was out, I wasn't backing down. I had my land, I had my spring, and I had a community that finally was ready to stop being afraid. After the court ruling, I expected things to calm down, but that's not how it worked. The decision had been made legally, publicly, and loudly, but Trish didn't disappear. Not exactly. She lost the property, yes, The judge gave her 30 days to vacate, but in the meantime, she lingered like smoke after a fire. Her car still sat in the driveway. Lights were still on at night. And some of her loyal supporters, well, they weren't ready to let go. For a while, things got weird. Flyers started popping up again. This time, they weren't about property values or landscaping. They were personal. Grainy photos of me taken from who knows where with bold letters across the top, the man who sued his neighbors. One even said, "If you see something, say something, community traitor." They were taped to mailboxes, pinned to the bulletin board at the community center, even stapled to a tree near the spring. I took them down, photographed every single one, handed them over to Deputy Monroe, who'd become a regular fixture in my life by then. She was already building a case of harassment, and then came the signs. Again, this time they were more aggressive. Bennett equals Blightland grabber history. ISNT. A get-out-of-jail card. At some point, someone egged my truck. Another night, someone poured sugar in the gas tank of the backup generator I kept near the cabin. They wanted a reaction, but I wasn't giving them one. Elaine's advice was clear: document everything. Stay calm. Keep the high ground. It wasn't easy. Then, one morning, a brown envelope appeared taped to my front door. No return address, no stamps, just a piece of duct tape holding it to the wood. Inside was a single photo. It was my Uncle Ray standing with Trish's father, back in the late 70s. They were shaking hands. In the background was the spring, untouched, its water glinting in the sun. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note. He knew exactly what he was doing. That rattled me more than I cared to admit. It made me question everything again. What if Trish was right? What if Uncle Ray wasn't some quiet guardian of the land, but a man who played just as dirty as the people he fought? I brought the photo to Frank Henderson. He took one look at it and shook his head. That was the day your uncle made your family safe. Trish's father offered him a deal: bury the documents and walk away with double the land. Ray refused. He made him sign the reversion clause. That handshake wasn't a partnership. It was a standoff. That settled it for me. But Trish wasn't done. With just 10 days left before she had to vacate, she made one last move. That night, my brakes failed. I'd been heading down the mountain into town to grab groceries. The road curved hard near the ridge. If I hadn't noticed the resistance softening under my foot, I might have flown off the road. I managed to stop using the emergency brake and coasted to a safe shoulder. When I popped the hood and looked underneath, I saw the brake line had been sliced. Clean. No animal did that. No age-related failure. It was deliberate. The mechanic confirmed it the next morning. "Still wet," he said, crouching under the truck. This was done less than 24 hours ago. I turned it all over to Deputy Monroe. Between the flyers, the harassment, the dog incident, and now this, she'd had enough. "We're going to press charges," she told me. "This isn't just HOA drama anymore. This is criminal." The story made the local papers. Headline: HOA president tied to harassment, vandalism, sabotage. The article laid it all out: how Trish had overstepped, how the historical documents were discovered, how multiple neighbors had confirmed she altered board paperwork, how the well's destruction wasn't about safety, it was about erasure. A few days later, I got a letter from the Ridgewood Hollow HOA. Only this time, it wasn't a threat. It was an apology, signed by the remaining board members, now a much different group than the one I'd faced in the beginning. They expressed their regret, their full cooperation with the court's ruling, and a unanimous vote to contribute HOA funds toward the restoration of the spring. They also announced something else. Effective immediately, Ridgewood Hollow's HOA would be dissolved. In its place, they were forming a community heritage council dedicated to protecting the unique, historic, and personal elements that made our neighborhood special. They asked if I'd be willing to serve as an advisor. I said yes. The restoration began a week later. It wasn't easy. The concrete had hardened deeper than expected, and several layers of stone had to be carefully cleaned and reset. but the crew worked with care, precision, like they understood it wasn't just stone and water, it was history. It was memory. The day the spring finally flowed again, clean, clear, cold, as ever half the neighborhood showed up. We didn't plan it. It just happened. People brought folding chairs. A few kids splashed their hands in the water. Someone brought lemonade. Mabel baked a pie. Thomas, the former HOA president, handed me a small envelope. "We found this taped behind the old charter," he said. "Thought you should see it." Inside was a yellowed letter, sealed in wax, addressed simply, "To the future owner of this land." It was from Uncle Ray. If you're reading this, it began, "Then someone has tried to erase what matters." But here's the thing about water. It always finds its way back. So will truth. Protect what's real. And don't let appearances fool you. What looks out of place is often what keeps a place alive. I read it 3 times, and I still wasn't sure how he knew all this would happen. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just knew that one day, someone would need to be reminded what mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that someone was me. It's been 6 months since the spring came back to life. Funny thing is, life looks a lot different now, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. The fights, the threats, the court dates, they feel like memories from a different lifetime. But the scars are still there, on the land, and in us. Trish eventually pleaded guilty to criminal mischief. The prosecutors struck a deal, no jail time, in exchange for a heavy fine and mandatory community service. I heard she's been assigned to a state preservation team cataloging historic sites across the county. Ironic, right? The woman who tried to bury a century of history now has to spend her weekends preserving it. She's no longer in Ridgewood Hollow. Her house was auctioned, sold off to a quiet couple from Denver. They painted the shutters blue, put up a porch swing, and they wave when they see me. I don't wave back yet. Maybe someday. The spring is fully restored now, better than ever. The new wooden roof matches the original structure. The stonework was carefully reset, and there's a small bronze plaque embedded just beside it. It reads, "The Bennett Spring, Est 1903. Protected Landmark. Reopened 2025. Every time I walk by it, I run my hand across the edge of that plaque. It still doesn't feel real. The new Community Heritage Council has been meeting twice a month. I sit on the advisory board. Me, a guy who just wanted to live quietly in the woods. Now I help decide which homes get their original porches restored and which heritage gardens deserve a community spotlight. The joke writes itself. But the truth is, I've come to care about this place. And not just the cabin or the land. The people too. Don and Mabel, of course, are family now. They never let me go through a Sunday without one of Mabel's pies showing up on my counter. Julia Marks planted a new koi pond this time with HOA blessing. And Frank Henderson? He visits every other week, usually bringing old photographs and stories that make me wish I'd known my Uncle Ray better when he was alive. A few weeks ago, we found something else. During the last phase of restoration, the workers uncovered another small metal container tucked deep beneath one of the foundation stones near the spring's base. Inside was a single item, a faded military patch from the Korean War. It was Ray's. There was no letter, no explanation, just that patch. I keep it on the mantle now, next to the court ruling and a framed copy of the historical exemption. People still ask me why I fought so hard, why I didn't just let the HOA have its way. After all, it would have been easier to walk away, less expensive, less stressful, and the answer is always the same. Because it wasn't just about a spring, or a shed, or a few HOA rules. It was about a legacy. It was about standing up when someone decides their power is more important than your truth. When they look at something that's real, that's rooted, and call it ugly, or outdated, or non-compliant. It was about a man, my uncle, who tried to do the right thing even when no one was watching, and about making sure that sacrifice didn't get paved over in the name of uniformity. A few days ago, The mailman handed me an envelope with no return address. Inside was a note, typed this time, "You may have won the fight, but the war never ends." I didn't bother reporting it, because here's the thing, they were right. The war never ends, not the way we think. The battle between people who build and people who control. It's always going on. But you choose how you fight. You choose whether you let fear take root or whether you plant something stronger, deeper. I chose to plant. And now, that spring, that little pool of water that started it all, it's become more than just a water source. It's a meeting spot, a story, a reason for people to walk a little slower, breathe a little deeper. Sometimes I catch a couple of teenagers sitting by it after school, their phones forgotten, just listening to the water trickle over the rocks. Other times, it's the older folks, Frank, Don, even Mrs. Jenkins, who gather there with lawn chairs and coffee, talking like they haven't talked in years. We don't agree on everything. We never will. But we all agree on one thing now. That spring brought us back to life. The land is still healing. So are we. But we're doing it together now. One quiet afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, and the sky turned that soft orange-pink color. You only get up here in the mountains. I sat out by the spring with Max lying at my feet. The breeze rustled the pines. The water shimmered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not just the absence of noise or conflict, but the kind of peace that comes when you know you've done right by the people who came before you and by the ones who'll come after. I glanced down at Max and said, "Well, boy, we didn't just fix a spring, did we?" His tail thumped once, slow and steady, and I smiled. Because sometimes the most valuable things we inherit aren't land or money or even water, they're stories, and the courage to keep telling them. Before I let you go, I want to take a moment to reflect on what this journey has really been about. It started with a spring, just a small, hand-built well on an old piece of land. But in truth, it was never just about water. It was about standing up for what matters, even when it's inconvenient. Even when people try to bury it, literally or otherwise. It was about honoring the legacy of those who came before us and protecting the quiet, meaningful things that don't always fit into a neat little box of modern expectations. For those of us over 60, we've seen how quickly the world changes, and sometimes it feels like the values we grew up with, integrity, respect for history, neighborliness, are fading. But this story reminded me, and I hope reminded you, that we still have a voice, and that voice matters. We can fight back against unfairness. We can protect what's right. And most importantly, we can teach the next generation what it means to stand your ground with grace. So, if this story spoke to you, if it made you remember something worth protecting in your own life, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button, share this with a friend or a neighbor, and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories to come, and I want you with me for all of them, because every time we share truth, we keep it alive. And sometimes, the truth is just waiting to be uncovered like spring water beneath stone.